this, but we roll like this. This blessed unrest, poems for prophetic justice on this Good Friday. 1, the Last Supper. Somewhere between Thanksgiving and Easter, my grandmother gathered us to her for a family meal. Let's call that meal Cuz. My mother called my grandmother on the phone and asked what time the dinner was to be served and what she should bring, cuz we were hungry. My grandmother answered, tell everyone to come at 7 and to bring appetites. She then disappeared in a plume of all-purpose flour and went back into the kitchen to prepare the gizzard gravy. When the time had come, when the meats had rested and the vegetables had been properly buttered, we sat at the folding card tables and waited. Before we began eating, my grandmother took the unevenly baked cornbread from the cast iron skillet, blessed, broke, and gave it to us, her children and grandchildren and stragglers and strangers with eyes bigger than our stomachs, saying, take, this is our body, which they have tried to crumble. Then she took the pot of simmering collard greens, gave thanks, and ladled to each of us over our burnt cornbread offering, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is our pot liquor, our Africa, our West Indies, our Louisiana, our Oakland, our leavings, our fixings, our big toe and our titties all up in it, our sugar low and our love high. She then said, remember what I taught you. Make sure that anybody come by hungry not only eats but gets fed. Yes. Yes. And when we ate, and oh when we ate, we were not only full but satisfied. So we sang and danced to some low old B.B. King before eating Aunt Leveda's peach cobbler. Amen. God working overtime gets a phone call. What if God was at work and got a call from Jesus, who was crying and scared, saying, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And what if God didn't know what was going on and whispered into the phone outside of earshot of the supervisor, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. And what if God was at work and got another call from one of Jesus' friends who confirmed that Jesus was in trouble? And what if Jesus' friend told God that some dudes threatened to take Jesus down off his high horse? And what if that news made God's knees buckle? What if God had just gotten this overtime, working graveyard, and couldn't afford another write-up for talking on the phone on the job? And what if God couldn't get off work because God had used up all of God's sick leaves from all them other times that God had gotten this very call? And what if God comforted God's self, hoping that God taught Jesus right? And what if God is like a lot of mothers in San Francisco and Oakland who regret ever telling their sons to respect the police? What if in God's spirit God could hear Jesus crying for God and God couldn't do anything? What if God's child was killed? And what if God only had God's self to comfort God? And what if God felt responsible for teaching Jesus about donkeys? And what if God remembers saying, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased? But also remembers all the other times that God wasn't able to get to back to school night, see him heal the lepers, or hear him preach at temple because she was trying to make ends meet and make these suppers last. And what if God couldn't bring God's self to identify the body and ask you to do it? And what if God didn't have the money to have the body embalmed and had to depend on women like my mama and your mama to take care of it? And what if God heard the body was absent and missing? Then God heard that they wouldn't release the body. Then God heard that they had sealed the autopsy report. What if God knew that crucifixion was just a pretty word for murder by the state and would not let the coroner list it as the cause of death? What if God couldn't afford a plot at Rolling Hills or Arlington? What if God couldn't sleep for 40 days because people started to pull God's ears saying they saw Jesus in Jerusalem with his disciples, and Paul up on Black Twitter saying he was on his way to Damascus and Jesus tried to blind him, and then Cleopa's black ass just trying to get on the TV said he was on his way to Emmaus and saw Jesus. What if God stopped believing in God's self? What if God was inconsolable and besides God's self? What if God was rocking God's self back and forth, crying Alex, Mario, Alan, Trayvon, Sandra, Eric, Michael, Alex, Mario, Alan, Trayvon, Sandra, Eric, Michael? But what if one day, like today, God heard something through God's grief, and God looked up, and there to God's surprise was Jesus? What if God can be surprised? What if God didn't know that those tears God was crying because God never had planned on having a child having to go through hell just to come home? What if God cried harder when Jesus came home than when they left home? And what if God left from creation towards Jesus, and Jesus left from death towards God, and they collapsed into each other's arms like they were both running away from something? And what if that hug is what all of creation feels like when we see God seeing us for the first time? And what if God swore that God would never step foot in another church until all churches became activist churches and all churches confirmed all black and all queer lives? What if God's children back in God's arms is what this Good Friday is leading up to? What if God does not want to rehearse that response of seeing us come back from whatever deadens us? What if God becomes God every time every one of us makes it home? And what if we all make it home? What if the God of the outpouring is the God of the inflowing, leaping up and opening God's self to receive us like a child coming home after a report to the contrary? And what if God gets to pray and we get to be God's answer every time? What if?